try the cool presenter app from my phone so I can move around, but it may not work. Let's see. Keynote. All right, so this is my presentation on RESTish APIs. Who am I? My name is Brady. I work for a company called BrightVerify. We do a couple 100 million API transactions per month. And of those transactions, the bulk of them are actually, oops, let's see.
Oh, you know what? It's super finicky.
Finicky, yeah.
Yeah.
It's okay, it's totally Stuart's fault.
Yes. Yeah, okay.
Okay.
Don't move.
So I'm not going to touch it. I'm not going to touch it. So the company I work for, we do a couple 100 million API transactions. We do them on behalf of our users, and most of those will end up consuming a couple of different internal and external APIs. So first I want to talk a little bit about REST. It's a representational state transfer, and what it is some guys were looking at what makes the web work so well. And they sort of extracted from that a set of rules which we call REST. And the rules are more complex than what I put over here, but there's basically you know, the HTTP verbs that you guys know, guys and gals. You know, like there's get is supposed to be nullipotent, which means it doesn't change anything. I just found out that word 7 days ago, by the way, so I always thought it was idempotent. But, and then there are things like put and delete, which are idempotent, meaning if you do them once, it's the same as if you do them 5 times. So you imagine if you delete something, and then if you redelete it, it's still deleted. So the same state it gets in. Also, for REST, we say that URLs or URIs describe resources, and that for classic REST, what you also want to try and describe the result of your transaction as an HTTP status code. So why should you use REST when you're building an API? And basically, it's 2 reasons. It's easy. Developers will pick up a REST API really, really fast. We have APIs, and whenever I get dragged onto a sales call, as soon as I get the developer on the line, it's like 30 seconds, and I say, okay, it's like this is the response, this is your API key, and they're like, oh, okay, we didn't need to have a call for this. And I'm like, I know, but I get in those calls anyway. But the other thing is that the actual infrastructure of the web already works this way. We have proxies and gateways and firewalls and all this other stuff. It's all built around HTTP. So because of that, you know, we can leverage that when we're building our APIs. But what I'm proposing is what I'm calling RESTish. So the REST standard, the way that people who are very, very strict about it, I think is a little bit silly. And if you just keep the bits about the REST spec that really work well and you toss out some of the bits that are a little bit more difficult, you end up with something that works really well. So we'll start again with the description of what REST looks like. And I'll start to basically delete things. First off, the silly HTTP verbs. We could probably get rid of those and still be able to do most of what we need to do. Next up, and this is one I get into Twitter fights about, is don't use HTTP status codes to actually describe the results of your transaction. So I'll dig into those a little bit. So this is a standard way that you lay out some sort of REST resource. You have, like, for instance, you say get/dog, that should give you a list of dogs. Get/dog/1, it should get you the first dog. You know, put/dog/1, that should replace the contents of that one. And there's also patch, which occasionally people use to just change some attributes of the dog. And delete/dog/1 will actually, you know, remove it. My advice again is don't go crazy with the verbs. You can really do almost everything you need to do with get and post. Use get for your reads, use post for your writes. And the reason why is because if you're building a public API, and the advice I'm giving now is really better if you're doing a public-facing API. But if you're doing a public-facing API, there's going to be all sorts of different people who are accessing it in all sorts of different environments. Some won't be able to use any of the funny verbs that you're requiring, so you're going to end up having some sort of thing where you either say You had to add an HTTP header saying x-method-override, or you're going to have to add a URL parameter saying, question mark underscore method equals patch, or whatever. And if you're going to end up doing that stuff anyway, why don't you just do it that way in the first place, as opposed to having two different ways of accessing your API. So this is my proposal for the RESTish set of resources in Verb. Sorry, am I standing in front of the thing? But it's basically the same stuff you all see on the web anyway. You still, use get to get a list of resources or to get a particular resource, and then we just use post for any time we're writing on something. So you post /resource/ID, and that should modify that thing. If you post maybe either an empty object or a special sentinel that says delete that thing, and if you post /resources, a new one that I added on the bottom, sometimes you don't know what IDs are already in use. So the standard one is if you post to /resource, that should say, okay, you have now created dog number 7. So that's basically my the bit about verbs. So now the question comes about status codes, and this is got to do. It wasn't really a Twitter fight; it was a Twitter disagreement with some friends of mine. So it was good spirited, but people really like the idea of trying to leverage the HTTP status codes as a way to tell you, if like, let's say your user lookup worked. And so you have already this well-defined concept of 200 series errors, or 200 series codes means success, 400 series means failure. So people like to do stuff where they try and describe the result of the transaction with the HTTP status code. And the advantage of that is all you have to look at is the status code. You don't even have to parse the contents. You look at the status code and know if your user lookup worked or whatever. But it can be a little bit confusing, and it will really screw you up if you're trying to do any kind of JSON-P style stuff, where if you're trying to do something where you have, you're doing third-party JavaScript that needs to talk to a central server, you probably will implement that with something like JSON-P or cores. And on the JSON-P side, it won't work if it's not a 200 status code. So this is what I mean when I say inconvenient. I've actually had people who used our old API, and the problem is if you, under certain environments, if you return anything that's not a 200, you're going to suddenly throw a big giant exception. And so the people who were trying to implement our API would freak out, and they're like, my code's having exceptions. Like, well, yeah, you've got to wrap it with a try catch, and then you have to go and look at which particular status code by, introspecting to the error, and it's a huge pain in the butt. But also, it ends up being pretty confusing. So, let's say you're a developer and you're developing something that uses this API, and you try and get customer number 12345, and then you get back HTTP/1.1404, blah, blah, blah. Did it work? Does that customer exist? Did you hit the API endpoint? You don't know. Maybe you missed the API endpoint entirely. Maybe it's not customers, maybe it's users. Or maybe you did hit the API endpoint and user 12345 doesn't actually exist. Well, that's the problem with trying to use these status codes to tell you what the status of the transaction is. That gets very confusing. What some people have also said you can do is, well, hey, what if in the body of the 404 error message, you actually describe what happened? Well, that's great, except not every customer will have access to an environment that lets you introspect into the contents of a 404. And so the other idea is what if instead of saying 404 not found, we say HTTP/1.1/404 user doesn't exist? Well, that's great, but again, some environments, some libraries won't let you look at the actual status code. So what I'm proposing is what I'm calling RESTish HTTP status codes, which is there's a pipe and there's contents. HTTP status code is the status of the pipe, contents is the contents. So, so let's say you are doing a lookup on customer 12345 and he doesn't exist. What I'm saying you should actually do is respond with a 200 and then a JSON blob that either says status no such user, or you can do an empty JSON blob or whatever you want to do. But keep it at 200. Why? Because the pipe worked. Your transaction, you were able to talk to the server, you got a response back from the server. Another idea is if you really are stuck on this, you can respond with a 204, which means no content. And then they'll have to figure out that if you get 0 bytes back, but it's a successful transaction, that there's no such user. So I wouldn't do that, but you could do that if you wanted to do that. And here's an example of what happens if you did miss the endpoint, where you completely misspelled the word customers, and now you get a 404. Yes, because the pipe is busted. You cannot get to your service. So this also works for like if authentication fails. You know, it'd be the same thing. You can throw 401. Why? Because it's the pipe that's broken, not the service. The same thing with like if you require TLS. If someone tries to hit your HTTPS endpoint and they hit it with just HTTP, you can bounce them back with a 426, which means TLS is required. And again, that's because the person who's using your API, their pipe, their connection to you is what's busted. And if your server actually fails for some reason, it spits out a 500. Again, that's it's the pipe that's broken there. We don't actually start to confuse the contents of that. And the reason why I made this whole thing is because we already did it the other way. The company I work for did it the other way, and it was a support nightmare. So basically, I think it was the Java guys and .NET people all had problems accessing our service because we would do this cool like special 400 message every time, like if you did a user lookup and it failed or something like that. And so they were throwing exceptions everywhere. They had to go wrap everything in try-catch. It was a big nightmare. So we actually ended up rewriting it, and all those problems went away. And it's definitely a lot better for us. And that's it. I'm Brady Weatherington, at UberBrady on Twitter if you want to start any new Twitter feuds about HTTP status codes. And there's my email if you need it, and hopefully I'll throw these slides up at some point. Yes?
So in your proposed RESTish API endpoints and verbs, how would you do a delete?
What I would do is I'd actually post an empty document. So in other words, let's say you would like want to say it's like JSON or XML or something, or okay, if it's a JSON thing, then I would say if you post to that endpoint and you post open squiggly, close squiggly.
The resources /ID.
No, I mean that's actually the contents of your post. So in other words, so you're posting to /resources /1 2 3 4 5, and the contents will just be open squiggly, close squiggly, and that's it. And that basically means swap that whole thing out, delete it, and then that it goes away.
Question?
Yeah.
Okay, so it sounds very much like you're, okay, well, in the first place, I don't know if this is a restriction, but these are just very simple HTTP status codes that you're working with here.
Mm-hmm.
There are a little bit more in-depth. There's an like a 404 dot, blah, blah, blah,
yep.
where there's additional subsets of some standard codes that are available, but you're not really in favor of using those?
Well, I'm not, again, because, you know, what I've seen when, you know, and so the thing I should have really touched on, I don't think I touched on it as hard as I wanted to, is that what I'm proposing here works really well if you're doing a public-facing API. So the entire world's going to access it. They're going to access it with some crazy library you've never heard of in your entire life. And some of those crazy people are going to end up doing things where, like, the moment you return anything that's outside of a 200, the exception, and that's where the big pain in the butt happens. Now, certainly, you're right. There are a lot of different status codes you can use. And maybe if you wanted to argue dancing around in the 200s as like your different way of saying, okay, 200, here's some content. 204, no content. Or maybe, you know, some of the other weird 200 style messages.
Even using a 200 to return some error code, when I go and scan visually scan a log file,
Mm-hmm.
I skip over everything that's a 200 because
Yeah.
I naturally assume that a 200 is a successful transaction. And there's nothing further to look at. But you're saying that, you know, you're going to break that rule in a sense, and you're going to say that 200 isn't a guaranteed, successful transaction. It could contain an error.
Well, I mean, it depends on how you're defining error. I mean, like basically, what I'm saying is that if the pipe is working, so in other words, your client is working, the internet is working as a whole, you're talking definitively to the server or to a cache somewhere or whatever, and you're getting a response back from that thing. And that thing is telling you that in the response, you are a complete idiot, we hate everything about you, everything sucks, everything's terrible, but the entire pipeline along the way is working, then I might be inclined to say 200. If it's authentication, no, that's a 401. I mean, and another way to reverse think about it is, what happens if you start with, okay, what would you want someone to actually throw an exception for? As from the point of view of the server implementer, and someone who's, you know, implementing against you, anytime something goes sufficiently wrong, you're like, you know what, actually, I wouldn't mind you throwing an exception on that one. And that's when I would say go out of the 200s.
See, I guess the thing that I'm looking at is that a log file is already full of tons of information, both good and bad.
Yeah.
You have to have some way of being able to very quickly identify exactly what requires attention.
Mhm.
And I guess by
Well, I
making
mean,
it 200,
It depends. Is a user, if you say, get me user number 123, and there is no user 123, is that an error bad enough that you want it to show up in the log file, or is that one where you just say, oh, well, you asked for a user that doesn't exist? And that's a question.
Tony has a good point. When you look at the log files, for example, you use this if you have it, you know, 200.
Yep.
On the other side, there are semantic after changing meanings of the verbs.
Yeah.
Specifically, delete, I'm not very confident with the using post.
Mhm.
Specific idea of making it object for the tag.
Yep.
Obviously, delete is not safe, but I don't know this.
Mhm.
Post on the other side, not safe and not adjective.
Yep.
So all the semantic meanings are changing in your article.
Well, I mean, the post that I'm proposing is still, it may or may not be idempotent. It may even, in fact, you know, which is exactly how it works right now. But yeah, I mean, and that's how.
You find quite a few words. I know none of them are true supporting any problem, but at least to get those quick patch, delete, those are the major ones that are perfectly supported.
I don't think they're supported in every browser. We actually ended up having an option like that where it was a URL parameter. You would say always 200 or not, and that was an option.
Exactly, because that allows folks who really want their server logs to be the source of truth to do that, but that also allows folks with perhaps less flexible clients to put it in.
And that's certainly one way to go. That's why a lot of the reasons why you'll see the weird verb workarounds that I was showing up there. You'll see that I think Rails does it. I think a lot of other modern environments do it, where certainly you can support all these, you know, funny verbs, but they still have to give that little fallback in the end where you say, you know, underscore method equals patch, and that's your real method. But the way the actual transport, for the most part, ends up being a post anyway. So, I mean, you know, honestly, you can do it however you want. And there's no, I'm not saying that the way that I'm proposing up here is the absolute best way on the planet ever to do it. If you're doing an internal API, go nuts. But I'm just saying that from the point of view of a guy who has had to support all sorts of weird, crazy clients that go and try and consume our service, us switching to this style of architecture made our lives much better, and also made it easier for the people to implement against us.
I've also seen other libraries, like string libraries. Island.js does something similar with the way that they define exceptions. Now, this isn't HTTP, but it's basically if there's a string error, then that's an exception. If there's a logic error, then that's just more data that you need to pass on and handle in the logic of the program, separate from exceptions that are run by the string process.
Yeah, and that's along the lines of what I'm saying here. I think another one is there's a REST client in Ruby, I think, that also has the same thing where trying to introspect and jam out the status codes starts to just get really clunky. It's doable, and there's nothing here that's, you know, I'm not proposing anything that gives you the ability to do something you couldn't do before. I'm just saying that what I'm proposing here is a lot easier.
I'm guessing that that's probably somewhat colorizing the content status so that you can walk down the log and, you know, the red ones, you know, jump out at you. The second part of this is that there are big clients who have very sophisticated proxy servers and firewalls that actually sniff return codes on things and take action if they're on.
Oh, absolutely, and they'll
just block it. I mean, and if you're trying to play games with the pipe.
Well, and there are certainly a lot of there are a lot of proxies and firewalls that see anything other than get and post or head, and they're like, you know what, I'm not messing with that, and then they'll go and block the request. And certainly those things they do exist, absolutely. But you know, again, you know, I don't want to start a religious war or anything like that. I'm just saying that, you know, it's I did it this way. It's awful easy. Maybe you should try it. You know, if next time you're trying to build something like this, if you want the whole internet to talk to it. It's, you know, if you go this way and kind of, I wouldn't say completely ignore the people who are really, really strict and rigid about the REST spec, I think you'll find that your life's a little bit easier. You have a little bit less code to manage.